Good afternoon, friends, and welcome to MTSO and the Schooler Institute. For some of you, this may be a first time. For some of you, you've been coming for a long time. Welcome, one way or the other. Hopefully some of you had a chance to be up the hill and have a little bit of lunch. Hopefully that hasn't made you sleepy. With that in mind, we brought really exciting speakers. So we've got a good day planned. A welcome to Lisa, Valerie, Gino, and Ryan. You'll get to know them better. Their bios are in your materials. Let's prepare for a good day, and I'm going to yield the floor to what comes next. Welcome, friends.
I want Jesus to walk with me. I want Jesus to walk with me. All along this tedious journey, Lord, I want Jesus to walk with me. Walk with me, Lord, walk with me. Walk with me, Lord, walk with me. While I'm on this tedious journey, Lord, I want Jesus to walk with me.
My soul longs for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and behold the face of God? My tears have been my food day and night, while people say to me continually, where is your God? These things I remember as I pour out my soul when I went with the throng and led them in procession to the house of God with glad shouts and songs of thanksgiving, a multitude keeping festival. Why are you cast down, O my soul? And why are you disquieted within me? Hope in God. For I will again, maybe someday, praise him, my help and my God. My soul is cast down within me. Therefore, I remember you from the land of Jordan and of Hermon and from Mount Mizar. Deep calls to deep. at the thunder of your torrents. All your waves and your billows have gone over me. By day, God commands steadfast love, and by night, God's song is with me, a prayer to the God of all my life. I say to God, my rock, why have you forgotten me? Why must I walk about mournfully because the enemy oppresses me? As with a deadly wound in my body, my adversaries taunt me while they say to me continually, where's your God? Why are you cast down, O my soul? And why are you disquieted within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise God, my help and my God. I'll sit down again. So, we'll get it. This conversation where you may join us in a moment, but we're going to talk among ourselves and you get to listen in as if this is a fish bowl and you're watching the fish do their thing. So we will talk about the theme and all of that, but I want to start with a story because it will be important to you, to my session on self-care. This past weekend, one of my sons in ministry, who leads a very prominent church in Atlanta, decided on Sunday morning not to preach. I heard all that. The reason he decided on coming back into town after having buried his auntie, after having buried his cousin 3 days before, and after having buried somebody else a week before that in his family. So they had 3 people in 2 weeks die in their family. And he said to his wife, I can't do it. She said, then don't. Now, I know people who pastor are like, oh my God. And he got up Sunday and said to the congregation, I'm not going to preach today because of this grief. We do have these other things going on in worship. We're going to allow God to move with that, but I'm not going to preach. And the congregation celebrated his decision. I tell you that story because oftentimes we say, oh, the people won't understand. It's like, the people know you're human. It's us who act like we're not human. All right. So, the gift of lament, the gift of how do you manage sorrow in the everyday living of these days? We're leading and preaching and planning worship and exegeting texts. So, that's my first volley into this conversation. And I'm going to start with you, introduce yourself. Because we have titled this The Gift of Lament. So talk about lament as a gift as a worship leader.
Thank you, Dean. I am Lisa Allen-McLaurin. I'm professor of worship, music, and spirituality here at MTSO. And as someone who has been in the church literally all my life and has served as a church musician nearly all my life, and has been ordained clergy for a good deal of my life. I think what you said, the story you began with, gives us a bird's eye view into why lament is a gift. Because lament gives us an opportunity to be our authentic selves, which in the modern and even postmodern church, we really struggle with. So often we buy into the ideas that worship has to be only joyful in order to be worship. And we have praise teams and we have worship leaders whose job it is to get the congregation up, up, up. We want everyone happy, happy, joy, joy. But that does not allow people to be their authentic selves because they may not be in a happy, happy, joy, joy space. With all that goes on in the world, it is often difficult to even consider that people would always be in that space. And so lament, first of all, in worship gives us the opportunity to face the realities of the worlds in which we live, the worlds in which we work, the worlds we traverse, our family lives, our own personal issues. And when I say it gives us the opportunity to face it, it gives us the other reason it's a gift is because it gives us the opportunity to face it communally. And so while I may lament privately in my secret closet, when I come to worship, if I am invited into lament or a space where lament is welcome, lament is, is all right, then I have a whole community of persons who are able to hold that space for me. And I have a whole community of persons who can then sit with me in that space. I'm not by myself. I'm not alone. The third reason lament is a gift in worship is because of what our theme says. It is a journey from struggle to hope. And so in the worship space, even if I begin in a place of lament, I don't necessarily have to remain in that place. And so as I'm lamenting, and we'll talk about this more, that lament is not just sadness or grief, it is also anger, it is also doubt, despair, confusion. And if you listen to those emotions, those are not often emotions we deal with in worship because we're afraid of them. As pastors, as worship leaders, we don't know how to hold people's anger and grief and doubt and despair. We say, well, they need to go to a therapist for that. And that may be true. But they also should be able to come to their faith community and express authentically who they are and know that that community, the gift that they give and they bring is to hold that space for them.
Thank you. You know, you may remember, I think you were still in Memphis when Katrina happened. And you may remember that I was scheduled to preach this Sunday after Katrina hit New Orleans. And we had 300 people from New Orleans sitting on the first 4 rows of our church. And they still had mud on their floor. And I had to preach. Now, we can talk about that sermon later, but I want to set that table as you talk about the gift of lament.
Okay, Eugene Gibson, everybody calls me Gino. I am the assistant professor of homiletics here at MTSO, and I serve also the Mount Olivet Baptist Church, downtown Columbus. The gift of lament, I think the gift of lament is we have a place to cry out to. I think that lament becomes the weary soul's confession of doubt, pain, anger, and the like, not in complaint, but in a courageous hope that the one the soul cries to listens, hears, and is able to sustain until change comes. Right? So I think that the gift of lament is that no matter how bad it is, it's not the end. We have someone who's able to resolve it. And even though there might be needed therapy later too, it allows us to release that which is on us, especially in the preaching moment, because, and I know who you're talking about, of course, my good friend there in Atlanta, when you have the pressure of performance,
Right.
it can really hurt you as clergy. Now, I have a couple of my members here. I hit something in my life. I didn't preach either. I called someone the night before and said, listen, I'll be there tomorrow, but I can't say anything. He said, you didn't write a sermon? I said, I have a good sermon. At least I think it's good. But I could not articulate it because of the cavernous feeling of grief that I was experiencing. So I think those moments, and I mentioned this in our class, those moments are needed when self-care is higher than getting that out right then. Sometimes you have to call a more prepared, stronger, in the moment vessel than you, and not succumb to the pressure of performance, believing that you're the only one that can preach.
Right. Right.
But God is still using other vessels, and sometimes that vessel is better for that moment than you.
One of the things that I hear from that is that you need somebody on speed dial.
Yes.
And I'm thankful to be on speed dial for several people, including you.
Including me.
And because it's a way of having communal relationship in leadership. And I think a lot of times as preachers, we solo when we don't have to.
Very good.
We pretend like we have to do this all by ourselves. I'm willing, I'm not a bad woman, because I always lose what I do. But if I were a waging woman, I would say, I'll bet there's somebody you could put on speed dial to help you with this. Now, so Ryan, we're passing the mic to you. I mentioned, I think you actually have to pass the mic to him. I mentioned that I preached after Katrina, and I set the stage for you. Can you imagine having a text, and I almost always preach the lectionary text, and the lectionary text was uncannily the right text for that Sunday. And I ended up preaching, what shall the righteous do? And there were 300 people sitting in front of me, caked in mud. They could not change clothes, they could not, whatever. So here's where the text and the responsible handling of the text becomes deeply important, because you can wound people if you don't. So go ahead, introduce yourself.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Ryan Schellenberg. I am Associate Professor of New Testament here. I should say, you heard that right, New Testament, and I come to the topic of lament with, is there such a thing as testament envy among New Testament scholars? I mean, among
Yeah, you can have testament envy.
that there's a lot more about lament in the Hebrew Bible, of course, than in the New Testament. But let me try to answer your question, starting with text from the Hebrew Bible, thinking about the gift of lament, and then coming to the New Testament, because it still is relevant, even if we don't find as much lament there. In the Hebrew Bible, I think lament is a gift as a genre of ritual performance.
Right.
That is, lament is not just crying out to God, although of course it is crying out to God, but it's crying out to God in a way that reflects the accumulated wisdom of the community and the multi-generational experience of the community that crystallizes itself in a set of poetic forms. That's why the Psalms are not just free-form poetry. They reflect a particular genre, and that genre encapsulates the wisdom of the community. This, I think, connects really closely with what you were saying, Lisa, about lament being a way that we are not alone in our grief. We're not alone in our suffering. Lament is something that we do together as a community. And in the Hebrew Bible, lament is something that the community does in the knowledge of its covenant relationship with God. That is, lamenting isn't just crying out to God. Lament is saying, God, you made promises, and now you better keep them. And
Where's
so
your God?
Right, and so it's exactly. And so it's in that experience of being God's gathered covenant people that Israel cries out in lament. Now, in the New Testament, you get things like rejoice in all circumstances. And I think these kinds of statements can easily feed into the kind of what historians of emotion sometimes call an emotional regime in our churches that enforces cheerfulness
Yeah.
that enforces what might be called toxic positivity. I think that's a pretty fundamental misreading of Paul. Paul says to the Philippians, rejoice in all circumstances. And 2 chapters earlier, he's talking frankly about his deep anxiety and grief about the illness of Epaphroditus. And a chapter before that, he's saying that he would rather die and go and be with Christ than continue on to experience the suffering that he's experiencing. So when Paul says rejoice in all circumstances, he clearly means something other than let's just all put a bright face on it. He also says in Romans, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. That's right. And if we're not weeping well together, we're missing something really important there. So I think lament can be a really nourishing antidote to that toxic positivity. I think the New Testament also hints at the ways that it can be an alternative to getting stuck in the rut of righteous indignation. Righteous indignation is a really powerful emotion, and there are times where we should feel it. But what works well as medicine doesn't always work well as food. I remember being...
You don't get to say that and not repeat it.
Okay.
That's a Selah moment. So say that one more time.
What works well as medicine doesn't always work well as food. I remember really clearly as an undergraduate student, I saw a bumper sticker on a car that said, if you're not outraged, you're not paying attention. And that resonated with me. I was, as an undergraduate, on a steady diet of Michael Moore documentaries and discovering all of the ways that greed and wealth and racism and, there's always something to be outraged about. And I'm not saying that there are not moments for outrage, but I have learned that you can't live stuck in the experience of outrage. You just can't live with that as your dominant emotional mood without becoming bitter and hardened. And in that way, lament is a gift because it allows us to turn over to God the things that we just are not strong enough to take responsibility for. Anger is an emotion that helps us feel our strength, right? And that's actually really important. That's not a bad thing, that's an important thing. But we're actually not strong enough. And so we need to also experience our grief. Grief is an emotion that allows us to be frank and honest about our weakness. Hand that over to God. And then, paradoxically, we find that in lament, in grieving together, we have an unexpected source of strength and resiliency, and lament builds solidarity, another source of strength for us.
Part of what you reminded me of is a saying by Funny Davis. Funny Davis is Angela Davis's younger sister, who's also an activist advocate. But she was at Proctor about 5 years ago, where she said, we cannot live on rage, and we have got to learn not just how to let go of our rage, but to resource it differently. And I think what I heard you say, you can say, either one of y'all can say more about this, is how lament resources us. Because I think that's what she was saying to us. And I think I just heard you say that too. So I'm passing the mic to whoever needs.
Well, I think one of the things that you read in Psalm 42 is the fact that the psalmist longs to be back in worship, or at least in a worship mode, right? Due to being far from that. Then the refrain, why art thou disquieted? Why is that, so crying out? Hope thou in God, for I shall yet praise him, her, they, right? I think it's important that we know, as Ryan says, that beyond our strength, even though anger will show us our strength and grief will show us our weakness, beyond all of that, there is a reservoir of strength in community, but then one even greater than that in our God, right? And I think it's important to know that we have that resource. All of us have bank accounts probably, and some of the good bank accounts cover you when you're short, right? They cover you when you're short, and that's what God does in many cases, always covers us when we find ourselves short. Yeah.
I would say, since you mentioned bank accounts, one of the things lament does for us is it helps to, I don't know if cure is the right word, but it helps to bring us face to face with the facade of self-sufficiency.
Okay, you don't get to. So that's for me.
Lament helps bring us face to face with the facade of self-sufficiency. In our world, that is one of the main goals, particularly for adults. It is to be self-sufficient, and that's not a bad thing. But often, our goals begin to reflect that we want to amass enough so that we are never found wanting, particularly financially. But then something happens, because the need to amass takes on a life of its own. And so then when is enough enough? Enough is never enough when the goal is simply to amass more. And in the hopes that we will never be caught without, that we'll never have to deal with what persons have dealt with who have lost their retirement funds, folks who have had tragedies to happen, folks who have had, any number of things, losing employment, losing homes, losing security. But lament helps us to see and live in the tension that we can never know what is coming. I don't care how much money, I don't care how many, your stock portfolio, I don't care. You can't anticipate tragedy. You can't anticipate whether there's going to be a crash. You can't anticipate, you can read some signs and say, well, I think it may be, could be, possibly. But when life comes in like a flood, lament is what helps us to hold on and to realize, okay, my hope is not in my 401k. Or my hope should not be, or should not have been in my employment, in this job. My hope should not have been, if I say that I am a believer, then my hope is in the one who made heaven and earth and who never runs out. And so this idea of self-sufficiency is rooted in a fear. It's a lot of times we think it's rooted in greed. And greed can lead us to try to amass more and more. But even that is rooted in a fear of being without. If you look at people's narratives, origin narratives, who You know, we say, oh, they're just a greedy tycoon. Oh, they're just a greedy person. If you could look back at their childhoods, I guarantee more than not, you would find children who went hungry, children who never knew whether they were going to have to move because it was time for the rent to be paid, children who never knew whether daddy was coming home, children who never knew whether they were going to be parceled out to relatives, children who went through traumatic events, because that is rooted in a fear of I am going to be left alone without a way of sustaining myself. So then lament is a resource that helps us to come face to face with the idea that we cannot sustain ourselves. That doesn't mean we shouldn't work. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do what we need to do to provide a living, you know, but it's saying, I understand that even with these things that I am doing, I can't ensure my own survival or thriving.
We're going to take questions in just a moment, so if you want to line up to the mics, you can start. All three of you have said something about the communal nature, and so I want to really highlight that part, because oftentimes I will say to students on that first day when I tell them to drink water, take a nap, and all that, I also say, don't do this by yourself. You know, find community. Don't do this by yourself, because we live in a culture that insists that we do it by ourselves. And I think that all of you have alluded to or said directly something about the community and what the community provides you in this liturgical, ritualistic lament. So, Ryan, Gino, you want to say anything about that? And then y'all can line up if you have questions.
One of the things that really strikes me looking again at the material in the Hebrew Bible, and this has to do with where does this community resource come from and how is it mobilized? So most of the texts we have from the Hebrew Bible are probably texts that are written by men. This is like the formal tradition of lament that we see in Psalms and Lamentations and so forth. But I'll talk about this a little bit more tomorrow, but there are plenty of indications that those traditions of lament derive from the funeral practices of grieving women, right, where women have primary responsibility.
Call for the wailing women.
That's right, exactly. Call for the wailing women who have primary responsibility for helping the community process its grief. And it's when Israel then experiences a national tragedy, when Israel goes into exile, what cultural resource does it have to draw on to process that? It has its traditions of lament. And I think that's interesting and important for us to notice that it's in that instance, the cultural resource is stored in the wisdom of these women who are grieving what you could call the routine trauma of just being mortal humans. We have death in our families. But then when there's a different kind of trauma, they can draw on that resource. I notice that I attend far fewer funerals than my grandparents did.
Right.
Why is that? Well, we have systematically segregated ourselves by generation.
Right.
And we have decided that rather than seeing the care of children and elders as a communal responsibility that we all share in, that's something we've professionalized.
Right.
And so in lots of ways, we insulate ourselves, we sequester death and put it off somewhere else. I think funerals are important cultural moments. They actually pass along to us knowledge about how it is that we face grief and hardship and do it together. And we are starving ourselves of that resource if most of us aren't meaningfully touched by the deaths of those who are older than us in our community. I don't think we can deal with trauma very well if we haven't learned to live with death.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Am I on?
You are.
I'm a pastor of a two-point charge in Kentucky. And you kind of set up what I wanted to ask about. Just like in history, white males wrote most of the history. And as you refer to the Old Testament, most of that is written by males. We hear their voice. We hear the angst of David's voice. And my wife grieves better than I do. I was taught at an early age to not grieve. At 7 years old, I was the oldest of 5 children who had a father missing in action, only because he got lost in the bottle. But I was supposed to man up and be strong for not only my mother, but the other family members. And as I've grown older and been in a position where people were really grieving, I find that men, much more than women, hold it inside. So my question is, how can, as a pastor, I help men understand, as well as women, but men we need more lessons than women do. Women get it a lot quicker than we do. But how can I teach men it's okay to grieve? It's not a sign of weakness.
You got the mic?
It just got hot too. I have to give the answer personally because I don't know that I know an exhaustive answer to what you have said. But I do know the power of modeling. My father was a crier, right? He was. He taught me to be okay with crying. And I remember, sometimes in worship, it's time for me to preach, but I'm not grieving, but I just feel the Spirit of God. And I've stepped back from the pulpit and taken my towel to my face to cry. Not a lament in that moment, worship. But a lady walked up to me and says, "Thank you for doing that because you give my husband permission." Sometimes it is the traversing of terrain that we've never gone into before in hope and trust that God will keep us that unlocks mysteries for other people. So as you, with your wife's help and support, get in touch with your emotions and are able to courageously be transparent, possibly, perchance, someone else will too. I don't know if that answers it, but sometimes it's a modeling thing. Sometimes they'll believe because you believe, or sometimes they'll do because you've done. But I didn't grow up not being tough because I cry. I learned growing up that sometimes the only recourse you have is to lament, is to cry, and sometimes that's the strongest thing that you can do.
I want to add that, and this is from the strong black woman myth. I think sometimes people are deeply afraid that if they start crying, they'll never stop, that they will unravel. And who's going to pick me up? Oh my God. So we've been taught to tuck it in, suck it up, hold it, whatever. And the best thing I know about that is, because I've done this, is just fall apart and let your friends catch you, right? Trust that you have friends, right? When I used to say to my brother, I think that if my head was on fire, y'all would say, "Oh, what a pretty flame," because you're used to me being the strong one. You understand what I'm saying? So I had to learn how to say, "No, this hurts. I'm sad." Or I had to literally learn how to do that with my family because they were used to me being the strong one. And it's a practice now. I mean, I said to somebody this week, I'm not going to look in their direction. That hurt my feelings, because you have to learn how to say, and, and, and trust that you're not gonna be unable to put yourself back together again, or God put you together.
And I would say, one of the things that I've heard men say is helpful for them is to gather with other men. Not necessarily, we're coming together so we can learn how to cry, but we're coming together because, men need that time to kind of talk to each other without anyone, looking or saying or thinking. But we trust, a group of men who trust each other or learning to trust each other. I think that is a wonderful way, because women do it all the time. That's why we live longer. That's the other, now, let me tell you something. Now, I can tell you immediately how to fix it. Let me tell you immediately how to fix it. And every man in your congregation will cry before they leave. Tell them, if you don't learn how to cry, your wife gonna outlive you and spend all your money. So that'll get it right there. But I have heard men say, because women gather. We gather on the phone, we gather in our little, whatever shopping, little coffee clutches, whatever you want to call it. When men gather, and I think it surprises them sometimes, whether it's on the golf course, whether it's at a game, whether it's, at the coffee shop, whatever it is, if they learn how to trust each other and then begin to share, and I'm saying to you as pastor, there's a way to kind of lead that, to help them not stay on the periphery of things, but to really get down to it and begin to share.
Dr. Nick Manning, who's a friend, one of my former members in Memphis, he talks about how men are shoulder-to-shoulder friends and women are face-to-face friends. If you take kids and tell them to draw their friends, the women, the little girls will draw the friends looking at each other, and the men or the males will draw shoulder to shoulder, which means we're more interested in what we're interested in than each other, right? So two couples could go out, and as they go out, the guys will be able to watch football together. They get home, it said, what was his name? I don't know. That's right. Y'all talked for 2 hours. He liked the Cowboys, What?
God help him for liking the Cowboys.
I'm a Bear fan anyway. But anyway, what I'm saying, my brother, is we have to get men to become interested in each other in a way that they care and become community, and not just hit the golf ball or watch sports or drink beer, which all is good. But we want to make sure that they are become interested and can help each other and hold each other up.
I also am thinking about your question as the father of a 9-year-old boy who I already see pressure in his environment for a certain sort of emotional reality. And I think teaching our boys emotional intelligence we can't expect that. We can't assume that that's going to happen unless we're really intentional about it. And so for children's ministry, I think being really intentional about teaching boys emotional intelligence and helping them experience their emotions frankly and honestly is really important.
You knew just where I was headed. This living in tension, when we can never know what's coming, that's our kids in high school. Women gather, men gather, and our kids are gathering. And you're talking about origin stories where they've all got this origin story of the pandemic and each other and all of the things that they are lamenting on their own. And they're grieving. Our kids are grieving. And it's being treated as, they're angry or, the parents aren't taking good care of them, but if you talk with them for more than 30 seconds, they start to cry. And I just wanted you to discuss how we can encourage lament in our younger kids who sit in the classroom all day wondering if somebody's going to come in and start shooting.
Yeah, our children now more than ever, and when I say children, I'm talking from birth to 18, and even some beyond. they are dealing with more now than young people have ever had to deal with. Not just the pandemic, but certainly the pandemic, but the actual thought that there may not be any trees by the time I'm 50. There may not be any ice, the Antarctic Circle may not even exist in my lifetime. The sea level is already, scheduled to rise however many feet within the next decade or so. And so they're faced with, where are we even going to live? And is there any way to prevent this? And why aren't the people who should have been preventing it, why haven't they done what they were supposed to do? They're dealing with social media. Bullying, of course, is just an epidemic. It's a pandemic. And they're also dealing, I think, more so than ever with parents who are distracted. Parents may be working more now than they've ever worked because housing costs, food costs. I mean, it's like we're being priced out of life. It's like we can't come in necessarily and kill you, but we can raise the price of food so high you can't afford to eat. It's healthy foods. But now even the fast food, child, I went to Wendy's the other day. I was like, baby, I don't want to buy the building. I just want a burger. Good God.
I swear.
I was like, is somebody else in the car with me? Did I order 3 sandwiches? Jesus. And so we've just got, our children are just carrying, and the parents, we're so distracted, many. And so the children are doing this all day on the phones. The parents are doing this all day on the phones. Now the grandparents are doing this all day. And he says more like, wait a minute. Now, wait a minute, sir. You didn't have to come for me like that, because now I'm doing that too now. And when are we sitting down at the tables anymore? When are we kneeling down by the bedsides and praying anymore? When are we getting up in the morning and having breakfast together anymore? When are we stopping when the children come in and saying, let's sit for a moment. How was everything today? How is it with your soul today? Not just, do you have any homework? Not just, did you get in trouble today? Was today a green light day or a red light day? Listen, but did you talk with your friends today? What did you all talk about? Did anyone care for you today? Did you exhibit care for anyone today? And so that's the piece that we're kind of missing. I think Lament can help us there too, because we can help our children understand we live in a distracted world. We live in a world of distraction, but we're going to stop being distracted in these moments. We're going to put stuff down. And even if we have to sit in silence, because at first the kids might be like, but if you sit still long enough with them, and you find something, maybe you like to do puzzles, maybe you like to do, word searches, maybe you like whatever, or you find something that kind of opens up the communication level, and you can begin to listen. That's the other thing, parents, we're guilty of that. We want to do all the talking. You haven't done this. You didn't make your bed this morning. You didn't do this. You didn't turn your work in. You didn't do that. And so the children are automatically on shutdown mode. But if we listen, and this is true in the church, we want to shuffle them off to their church. We have children's church. We have youth church. And that's great. You need to have great people who are working in there. But when do we talk intergenerationally about what's going on with them? Because that's where that wisdom that collective wisdom comes into play. Not as a, I've been down this road and I can tell you exactly, but let me share my experiences. And then be real about those experiences, because we wasn't always saved and we wasn't always holy, and we come on somebody.
I would also say you hit on something, and I think the laments in the Hebrew Bible are good at this, which is Selah, is be still, be quiet. I think we are so afraid of silence as a culture. Like, we got to have background noise on, we got to whatever, and that too allows us, that ability to sit allows us to even feel what we're feeling. Because a lot of times I will say, I find it interesting, I will ask students, well, what do you think about this? And they'll say, I feel like, and they're talking about what they think. And then I'll say, well, what do you actually feel? And then they'll say, I feel like so-and-so ain't whatever. And I'm like, no, what is your feeling? Because we aren't in touch with those things. So lament is foreign to us because our very feelings are foreign to us. We have about 10 more minutes. We'll take this question.
Okay.
Jump on up there.
I know, for sure, people.
Hi, Deirdre.
Hi. So I have a question. It's sort of like biblical, but I think it's open to everybody. Just as far as origin stories. Now, with Israel having their origins in so much pain, and Dr. Ryan talking about testament envy, do you think the communal pain that Israel experienced contributes to all the lament that we have in the Hebrew Bible? And then with the origin of, say, the Roman Empire and the honor and shame culture, do you think that contributes to a lack of lament? And kind of on top of that, when you think of the Apostle Paul, in being in the honor and shame culture, do you feel like he was speaking out against that when he talks about lament and when he goes into themes of unity, which maybe kind of push against honor and shame? And also, I know in our, I'm kind of long-winded, Doctor, even in emails, and I'm a little long-winded, so this is the last part. And also, I know in our Western culture, we talk about individualism a lot, but do you think there's remnants of that honor and shame that prevent us from lamenting and being vulnerable?
Ryan, you're on.
Okay, I will try. I think, yeah, certainly Israel's history is part of the reason we have such a rich tradition of lament in the Hebrew Bible. The repeated experience of communal trauma feeds this tradition, and that gives us then a resource to draw on. It's really interesting, actually, that we don't see more explicit lament in the New Testament, although it's not totally absent. A preview of some of the things I'll talk about tomorrow, perhaps, but Jesus weeps before the city of Jerusalem. Jesus laments the fate of his beloved people. And that's part of that story, too. I wonder about the ways that eschatological expectation affects the presence or less presence of lament in the New Testament. You know, Paul says in 1 Corinthians this very curious thing, that because the time has grown short, we should rejoice as though not rejoicing and mourn as though not mourning. That is, somehow, because he has this vivid eschatological expectation, he also says you should buy as though you're not buying, right? Somehow you're less invested in whatever is going on than you would otherwise be. It's different from lament, but it's another way of saying my hope and confidence that God ultimately is in control puts everything else in a different perspective. So it's a different strategy, actually, than lament for dealing with the experience of suffering and loss, which, of course, yeah, Christians in the Roman Empire had plenty of that suffering too. They have different resources that they use to engage with it.
Well, on that piece about God ultimately being in control, I think that lament might be different for certain demographics as well. Because if you have marginalized sectors of society that lament more than some other sectors of society, then that lament has to be fastened and foundationed on the fact that ultimately God is in control of everything. The Negro spirituals, up above my head, I hear music in the air. There must be a God somewhere. Just last week, a week and a half ago, I stood at the slave castles in Ghana, and I was thrown off. I'm thrown off at Elmina, which was founded in 1482. Y'all didn't get it. 14. This country, these all but United States, were founded in 1776. 1482. And there's a dungeon that has a peephole that when you are going into church, you look down at the enslaved cargo. And what is the hymn you sing then? There's a hymn up there, but there's also a hymn down there. And that hymn down there is a lament that ultimately God is in control of even this, especially when you're ankle deep in feces, urine, and throw up. God is bigger than even this. So that kind of lament that comes down through generations and fastens itself in this African-American marginalized people, but there are other marginalized people that have laments. The way that women are treated, same gender loving and all those things. There are laments that are there that might not be the same lament as the writers of history that my brother shared about, right? So I think that's important to look at as well.
I mean, part of what sorry, I forgot this mic wasn't on. Part of what you are pointing to, Dr. Gino, and perhaps Deidre, part of what you're pointing to, and I hope over this next couple of hours when you're in your sessions, you all will explore these things more deeply, whether you're looking at how do you take care of yourself, or how do you approach the text, or how do you preach, or how do you sing. Part of what I'm hoping that you will think through is, and meditate on, how often am I anti-Christ? And here's what I mean by that. So determined to do it by myself. Where you see Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, he says to them, come go with me. And the limit is really, y'all can stay awake an hour. Like, I mean, that's a lamentation, right? Because he needs them there with him. This is Jesus. So I always say to people, if Jesus needed his boys, who y'all? That think you need no one else to be sort of in this with you. So I hope that over the next day, while we're thinking about this, that you're also thinking about resources in your own life that you have either not tapped into, not even considered a resource, haven't thought about the text in a certain way, haven't sung. I'll end with this story. When Michael Brown Jr. was killed, I was scheduled to preach in Kansas City, Missouri the following Sunday. And like many people, I was still in shock, right? Like, I'm just in shock. But I get to this church where I'm preaching, and they sang all happy, happy songs. Again, the lectionary helped me. The lectionary was, care us not that we are. It was the story of the storm on the sea and Jesus sleep in the hull, and they were like, listen, the storm is taking us out. Do you not care that we're dying? Right? So that was the text the Sunday after Michael Brown Jr. was killed. But I'm sitting in church and they're singing all happy, happy songs. It doesn't even come up in the prayers. The people's lament don't even come up in the prayers, and I got to preach. And they're singing, and I'm singing under my breath, Dr. Judy. I'm singing, I'm singing James Cleveland, Peace Be Still. Pastor, the storm is raging. I'm singing that in my head while they're singing whatever Hillsong they're singing. It was a Hillsong. It really was a Hillsong song. Yeah. And so when I got up and I said, I deeply appreciate worship, but the song I needed today, and I started singing it, and the congregation started crying, just weeping. And then I preached from the text. That was the lectionary text, right? Uncanny, the way the lectionary can be so on point. That's why every time people say, oh, I'm tired of the lectionary, I'm like, you ain't paying attention to the world. That's your problem. Okay, but that's another story. But afterwards, after the benediction, a woman came up to me and said, I was so traumatized by Michael Brown's death because my daughter was killed in a drive-by shooting, and I never cried about it in church.
Wow.
But when you said, do you care that we are perishing? I've asked God that 1,000 times, she said. What I'm trying to say to you as we get into the rest of this week, and I'm about to let you go, is these questions are in the minds of the people in the pulpit. You think you're holding it in, so are they. What if we called for the wailing women and just had a wailing session? Just let everybody cry. Or that Baby Sugar's holy. Some of y'all dance, some of y'all laugh, some of y'all cry. And after a while, some of y'all will be crying, some of y'all will be laughing, some of y'all, until you're exhausted. What if we learn the gift of lament? Thank you.